Welcome to LFPL's At the Library series, an ongoing podcast featuring author talks, programs, and events at the Louisville Free Public Library. For more information about upcoming events, visit us online at www.lfpl.org/upcoming events.
Start with Tori Murden McClure, who's the president of Spalding University. That's a Catholic university in Louisville, Kentucky. Oh, wait, I guess you already knew. I copied from Wikipedia and pasted this in here. A graduate of Louisville Collegiate School, she also holds a bachelor's degree from Smith College, a Master of Divinity degree from Harvard Divinity School, a law degree from the University of Louisville, and an MFA from Spalding University, which is a Catholic university in Louisville, Kentucky. That was my big finish right there. She's a former board member of the National Outdoor Leadership School and was chair of that board from 2010 to 2012. Some of you will know what the National Outdoor Leadership School is. I assure you Will Cockrell does. And many of you likely already know that she's announced her retirement from Spalding for this June. I'm guessing that she won't be spending her days watching the Home Shopping Network, but I look forward to seeing what she will be taking on next. She'll be interviewing tonight or having a conversation with Will Cockrell. You may not have heard of him. He's a brand new author. Oh, no, wait, that's not right. This is his first book. He's actually a prolific writer of nonfiction and investigative journalism. His articles have appeared in publications including Outside Magazine and GQ, or as I like to call it, the magazine formerly known as Gentleman's Quarterly. He's a native of Marin County, California. If you've been to the Golden Gate Bridge, you've seen Marin, California across the way there. After flirting with a career as an adventure guide, he settled on the similarly daunting vocation of trying to make a living as a writer. In pursuit of that, he has a bachelor's degree from the University of California, Berkeley, and a degree that may or may not be a master's degree. It's unclear because he got it from a university in London or in England, but that was in journalism. Like many of the authors that we bring to town, though, he's further proof that it can, in fact, be done, that someone can make a living as a writer. This is going to be really fun. Please join me in welcoming Tori Murden McClure and Will Cockrell.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, hello. Oh, wow, lots of friends in the audience and some good writers in the audience. So I learned, I was saying earlier that, I may be the only one here who's read the book, and I was already corrected. There are folks in the audience who have completely finished your book.
Wow.
So
my wife hasn't finished my book.
I don't think my husband's ever read mine. So for those who have not, can you give them a synopsis?
Yeah. So Everest Inc. I have been covering the outdoors and adventure and climbing for most of my career, so about 20 some years, and I've been a climber myself for my whole adult life. So I was really keenly aware of all the headlines around Everest that popped up, usually every spring, which is when everyone goes to climb it. And they were all very, very similar about the disasters and the mess, the colonialism. And I realized that we needed a book that was sort of a counter-narrative to that. I knew enough about the industry and about what had gone on over there and what had been gotten so wrong in how they report on Everest that I thought that it was time to do another Everest book. There's a ton of them out there, but none of them have looked at the guiding industry as its own era. So it's about a 40-year chunk of time between, say, 1985 or late 80s to now. And by looking at the guided era on Everest, which is very unlike everything we knew about the mountain before that, when it was very exploratory, and you have all these flashpoints and stories that we will probably talk about that are only in the context of the guiding era, people being guided up the mountain, paying money, who are not as experienced. And so really it's a book about the guiding industry, the history of the guiding industry, and it's a counter-narrative to probably what most of you in this room think you know about Mount Everest.
Cool. And, he talks about guides, and there's this just fantastic, and he's not quoting somebody else, this is his writing. Guides need to have the leadership skills of a military general, the stamina, strength, and agility of an Olympic triathlete, the patience of a preschool teacher, and the cool head of a bomb squad technician. I thought that was a lovely description.
Yeah.
So, what is your favorite answer to the question, why climb?
Well, I think that it's actually easier to answer, strangely, when it comes to Everest, because what I kind of knew going in and was able to solidify in my research was that it's climbers who have a hard time answering that question. Climbers, people who want to become climbers and put themselves in that risk and become self-sufficient in the mountains and actually do much more dangerous things than people who go to climb Mount Everest. People who go to climb Mount Everest is everyone. There's literally every type of person that goes to be guided up Mount Everest. And through some amazing conversations, it really was clear that there is no one reason to climb Everest. It's as individual as each person. So as many people climb Everest, that's how many reasons there are to do it. And it's always a very personal reason to do it. And the best way I can relate it to people is people who want to shake up their life a little bit for various reasons, and you decide to do your first marathon, or you decide to do your first 5K run. Any of these things are what these other folks have decided Everest is for them. And almost every time I meet these people, it sounds almost exactly the same, the way they describe the preparation, the reason they're doing it, why it excites them, why it makes them happy. So, yeah.
So I would ask the question that, there's always a great debate about if you were guided on an expedition, somehow your success is not your own. How would you describe an amateur in the mountains?
An amateur. Well, I think one of the main principles of being a climber, in the stricter hobby sense, is being self-sufficient. I would say that's a probably really easy way to separate a client or an amateur from I hate using the word real climber because it seems derogatory the other way, but someone who's committed their life to climbing would be that self-sufficiency. Specifically, the ability to get themselves out of trouble. And there's one thing that we may touch on down the road a little bit, but that was probably one of the pivotal moments in the guiding industry, was in the 90s when the Sherpas were becoming so good at helping the Western guides. And they were going up and down that mountain multiple times, carrying twice as much stuff, and basically became they were absolutely necessary to even run the industry. And people often would say, well, then why are they not called guides? And why are they not being paid $25,000 like this American guide over here or whatever? And I put this question to the Sherpas, right? I wanted to know from some of the best Sherpas over the last 30 years, why was that happening? And it was them who said to me, again, the Sherpa saying to me, we didn't know anything about rescue or first aid. They were very specific. They said if someone broke their leg high up on Mount Everest, we wouldn't know what to do. If someone fell into a crevasse, the rope system to get them out is so complex. You probably know it.
Yeah, I do.
They said they had no idea. And so they're hollering for the guide to help, a Western guide who's essentially gone to like graduate school to become a mountain guide. And it was interesting to hear it from them, why they themselves didn't see them as guides back then. They were load carriers. But that was a turning point. It was right about that time that the Western owners of the guide companies and the Western guides, who were very close with the Sherpas, asked themselves, why is it that they can't be guides? And that was the beginning of their training and their mentorships that got us to a completely different place today, later in the book. But that was the turning point. It was deciding to say, you should be called a guide and you should get paid the same as a Westerner.
Yeah, in the book, I look at the book starts in a very sort of finite period of sort of the guiding industry starting on high mountains and going to Everest. It would be interesting, but we're both Knowles people, National Outdoor Leadership School, founded by Paul Petzel and a couple of other folks. He was part of the 110th Mountain Division in World War II, and a lot of the gentlemen who were part of that division came back and founded ski lodges and other things because they knew the first aid, the climbing systems. They invented them all, and came back and started teaching others how to be self-sufficient in the backcountry. And that created a whole guiding industry across the United States. And I think, there was sort of a European tradition of guiding people up Chamonix and other European mountains, but the U.S. took a different kind of more teach people how to walk uphill, teach people how to walk up a steep hill, then teach people how to climb, as opposed to, here, put one foot in front of the other and I will tell you where to put your feet. Yeah. Yeah,
that's very true, actually. The guiding tradition in America was very different from Europe. You guys may have been to France. Some of you maybe seen how it's almost like being, working at the local ski shop, being a guide there. I mean, you get your training and there's a big, beautiful building where, you go in and check in for the day and they have you meet your clients, but it's true. It's very much like a short roping kind of situation. It's just make sure you don't die. They don't do a lot of teaching, I think, over there. And in America, the American tradition of guiding was always very different. It was always about teaching folks some of that self-sufficiency so that they wouldn't need a guide going forward. On Everest, just to circle back to that, because the primary challenge on Everest is the altitude. Right, it's almost impossible to explain how exponentially terrible it gets as you go higher. I've been to base camp; that's as high as I've gone, and I felt like I got run over by a truck at base camp for 3 days. It was hard. It's an art form even to live at base camp, and so it's the altitude. And what's interesting about that is that there's a lot of people who show up who are genetically good at altitude and are incredibly strong on Everest, but they're amateurs.
Right.
And that's one of the interesting things about Everest is you can have people who have never climbed and will never climb again, but they actually don't find it so hard.
Yeah, and so talk a little bit about the gentleman who kind of opened the door, being Dick Bass, and his, he was phenomenal at altitude.
He was, and a character, and ended up in a really unique situation that I kind of argue kicked everything off. Dick Bass was an oil man. He came from oil money in Texas, and he went on to buy Snowbird Ski Resort in Utah. He had money, and he loved being outside, and he loved to talk, and he was sort of eccentric, very likable, And he had climbed a few mountains, and he and another gentleman who happened to be the president of Warner Brothers Pictures at the time had decided they shared the same dream of wanting to climb the highest mountain on each of the 7 continents, what became known as the 7 summits. And in a few of those cases, these are very easy mountains to walk up, essentially. But of course, you can't do the 7 summits without doing Everest. And so, not being a climber, he was dead set on doing the 7 summits with his partner, Frank Wells, and he went about finding the guides throughout the world that would just take him to each of these mountains and help him pick them off. And he was a machine. They found that while he was not necessarily interested in becoming a technical climber, he was incredibly talented at altitude and incredibly strong. And so this led up to Everest, of course. And he got some opportunities to climb Everest. He attempted it 4 times, and on the 4th time is when he summited, and he barely made it down alive. The person who took him up Everest that year, 1985, was a gentleman that maybe some of you have heard of, David Brashears, who passed away about a month ago. Yeah. Very suddenly, very unexpectedly. David Brashears is probably one of the best climbers, mountain cinematographers of our time. Did the IMAX movie that became huge about Everest. David Brashears was a young hotshot climber and became friends with Dick Bass. And so long as Dick Bass was paying expenses, David Brashears wanted to get him to the top of Everest. They had a real father-son kind of bond, and Dick Bass made a mistake with his oxygen. He turned it up too high and ran out at the top. So David Brashears had to give him his oxygen. Anyway, the coming down was not a given. It was real touch and go. And they did make it. And the pivotal moment that I'm talking about is 2 weeks later, Dick Bass went on The Tonight Show. Got invited by Johnny Carson to come talk about the 7 summits. And Dick Bass famously would make comments like, the only exercise I get is running through airports. He liked to almost portray himself as the ultimate amateur. And that was his thing, was to say, technical skills did not get me up this mountain. It was tenacity. And on The Tonight Show that night, he played that same character, told America, 10 million people watching The Tonight Show, it's not really about knowing how to climb. It's just about, having it in you to do something big, to dream big like that. And even though Dick Bass was not technically guided up Mount Everest, right? You couldn't call him the first client on Mount Everest. Without a doubt, that night on The Tonight Show and every appearance he ever made after was basically telling the world, shouting to the world that you do not need to be a climber to climb Everest. And I think that was the turning point. I think all the guiding companies after that realized, hold on a minute, we could guide the 7 summits. And that it became like a little cottage industry of its own.
Yeah, but you also thanked David Brashears on The Tonight Show, didn't he?
He did. Yeah, exactly. The way he put it, of course, he just said, I have to thank a gentleman, David Brashears, who helped me in this whole endeavor. Yeah. And that was it. Yeah. Yeah. And I think he did give David Brashears, for the record, I think he gave him a lifetime season pass at Snowbird.
That's worth your life.
Yeah.
Being a rower, I like to do things backwards. We don't need to wait till the end for questions. So if you have a question, there's a microphone in the middle, and if you wander there, that will clue me in that you would like to ask a question, because we'd love to hear what you want to know about. I had a great question that left me when I was trying to make that comment.
It'll come back.
So we've all, I'm assuming most of us have seen the conga line pictures from 19 and 22, and I don't think it's any different now. No. What are your thoughts on kind of the having to get in line to climb this mountain?
Yeah, the conga line photo is a great example of the types of articles that come out every spring that evoke the exact same feeling every single time. That climbing Everest is kind of gross. That it's just like this full of irredeemable egomaniacs who are willing to sort of go through this, and that the mountain's trashed. And that photo in 2019, I bet a lot of you remember it, because it probably was on the front page of many papers. Yeah. And it just looks like Disneyland at the summit. And it was a very strange set of circumstances that caused that. And it does happen most every season, but it doesn't have to. It's a conscious choice. So that situation of waiting for 2 hours in what should take an hour is a calculated decision by mostly the Nepali guide companies. And they bring up enough oxygen for it to work. And it's an aesthetic choice that I think a lot of Westerners would not make. None of the Western guide companies are willing to do it. But essentially, you're hoping for a good weather window on Mount Everest. That's what it's all about. You're going up and down the mountain over and over, and then you're waiting for a good weather window to finally go to the top. It's got to be like 4 or 5 days of good weather. And a lot of times, the Nepali companies, who are very shrewd businessmen and run amazingly huge, cool companies, they are very dead set on going at the first weather window. Just in case there's not another one. And they like to make their clients happy. And so that's what they do. And they make sure there's enough Sherpas and Sherpa guides and oxygen up at the top to deal with sitting in line for 2 hours, and it doesn't become the disaster you think it's going to become. But what I think that we probably relate to, or what's strange to us when we see that, is we go to the mountains for a little bit of solitude, et cetera, and it's very weird. And that same season, 2 separate guides, a woman from New Zealand and an American guide, both told me that on separate occasions, because they wait for the next weather window, which may not come, by the way, and then they have to turn to their clients and say, oops, sorry. But it usually does, and you have to be patient on Mount Everest, they all say. There could be another one, there could be 2 more, there could be 3 more. And both of these guides said that when they brought their clients to the top of Mount Everest, a couple weeks after that photo was taken, they had the entire summit to themselves on a beautiful day. Same season. And it was just an aesthetic choice that those guides made. But now we're living in an era where the debate about whether we should be criticizing the Nepalese aesthetic choice is an interesting discussion now.
Yeah, and well, while we were there, let's go ahead and go down that rabbit hole of, it was sort of the Western guides who opened the door. Absolutely, the Nepalese figured out, okay, we need better training. They asked for better training. They got better training and began to take back their mountain. And talk a little bit about that transition from kind of the big 5 to other players.
Yeah, so you had these 5 big legacy companies. Trying to think now. 1 British, 1 New Zealand, and 3 American. Yeah,
that's right.
Sorry, I'm forgetting my own book. And they were the ones that really laid all the groundwork for everything on Everest. Then that period in the 90s that I mentioned came along. They had formed really close bonds with a lot of the strongest Sherpa climbers in the Khumbu Valley. These are people they would work with every year, same team, sometimes whole villages. That was one thing that was interesting. If they had their head guys from a village, say like Fortse, that entire Sherpa team, the cooks, everyone would be from Fortse. And like the whole village would be employed by a guiding company. And along with this moment when they realized the Sherpas did not have the training and may never elevate to that place, which didn't sit well with the Westerners, there was also a question floating around, which I always feel like is maybe one of the most important things to pause on, which is people started to ask, hold on a minute, are the Sherpas doing this because they have to? So it was a hard question to answer. Maybe didn't have an answer, but it was certainly floating around this idea that they were doing it to put food on the tables of their families. Because if one of those Sherpas died on the mountain and a head of household is lost in those families, it's devastating. It's one of the poorest countries in the world. That question started getting asked a lot. And that was another reason that the Westerners kind of tried to climb out from under this colonialist reputation they had and lead their Sherpas, or open doors for their Sherpas to try to take as much opportunity as they possibly could and see which ones of them backed away and which ones of them leaned in. And then that generation of Sherpas made very good money in the Khumbu Valley. Khumbu Valley is very prosperous. And they all were able to send their kids to school in Kathmandu and abroad. And all of a sudden, the children of that generation of guide, they were becoming pilots and engineers. And, they really it really opened all the doors for the Sherpa culture. But what's interesting is that some Sherpas didn't go become pilots and engineers. They decided to come back to the Khumbu Valley and become mountain guides because of what their father or mother did. So they had worked in the mountaineering industry for so long, it's what they knew, and they actually came back and became climbers, which is not what we would have called them in the 90s when they were being basically paid to go to the top, and it was a question of whether they were just doing it because they were desperate. There's a new, younger generation that came back with a totally different outlook on life. They're working sort of side by side with some of the older ones, but the older ones are aging out of the industry, essentially. And to be totally honest, one of the most fascinating things about the Everest industry now is that they do have a workforce problem because of all the pilots and engineer Sherpas out there. They're not all of them are working in the mountaineering industry, but enough of them, and they came back and they actually decided to start their own companies. And so these are young Nepalis that love the mountains, love climbing, are not just doing it for the money, and they're starting companies emulating the Westerners. And this is where we are today. I don't know how far we're going to get into it, but basically 85% of the industry is Sherpa or Nepali owned. So the Khumbu Glacier base camp today, if you look around, it is 85% Nepali companies, and then this other 15, the legacy companies, the 5 that we mentioned, and then a few Western companies that are sort of on the rise. And that's it. And the legacy companies have less than a half dozen clients at a time, and then their next door neighbor, Seven Summit Treks, a Nepali company, has 100 clients. Yeah, it's completely different.
And talk a little bit about, there are Nepali rock stars now, like Nims.
Nimsdai. If anyone's heard of Nimsdai, he's probably, this is a tough one, but I would almost call him the most famous mountaineer in the world.
Probably.
I don't know if Conrad Anker's more famous, but Nimsdai came along very late. It's really interesting because he didn't have a lot of experience. He's a former Gurkha Special Forces, British Special Forces, an incredible sort of person from a strength and stamina standpoint. He climbed Everest and kind of just looked around and just decided he wanted to start his own guiding company. He also did something before that. He set a record for climbing all the 14 8,000 meter peaks in 7 months. The previous record holder was 7 years. And so that sort of put him out into the world. And then he said, and now I'm starting a guide company. And that documentary is on Netflix. I don't know how many of you watched it. It's called 14 Peaks. And it's about this Nimsdai character. It's quite fascinating. And he is a character. He's a love him or hate him kind of guy. His ego is off the charts. And he says he can rub a lot of people the wrong way. But he has his own clothing line. There are billboards of him all over Kathmandu, perhaps even all of Central Asia now. I don't know how big it's gotten. Yeah. But he has his own brand. He's without a doubt a multimillionaire just from the Everest industry. And he's not the only one. There's Ming Maji, and there's all these different guys that have sort of emerged as kind of rock stars within that industry and are making, unimaginable money for Nepal. That's the thing. For the country, not just themselves, right? The amount that this is helping the Nepalese economy is huge. It was a conversation with Conrad Anker where he was the one who an American, probably the greatest living American alpinist, who has spent a ton of time in the Khumbu Valley and holds it very dear, and has even founded a climbing school there for guides. And he's very, very philanthropic. And the way he described it to me was, he said, Nepal doesn't have a cricket team to compete against Pakistan, their neighbor, or India. They don't have a soccer team. There's really it's hard to find something to rally around, take pride in, except Everest and mountaineering. And there are statues of mountaineers, of the first female who climbed it, Tenzing Norgay, around different places in Nepal. And that is their pride, is around this mountain and what they've accomplished on it. So this direction where we've come with it is incredibly meaningful. Mm-hmm. They always felt like it was their mountain, you can imagine, but it's taken a long time for them to feel like it was their industry, and it's really meaningful where it's gotten for them.
Yeah, and so there's this, among explorers and adventurers, and they're not the same, a kind of a small world, and a lot of us are really petty, and we make fun of each other for what I think are stupid reasons. And Nims did all the 14,000, he did all the highest peaks in a very short period of time. But he would get, take a helicopter from here to there and have all these support crews setting things up for him. But he still climbed them, right? And people are whining about how he went about it. And I was so grateful. Reinhold Messner, who was the first to do all the highest peaks without oxygen, who was probably the greatest mountaineer of my generation, was like, hey, the man climbed them. And Jimmy Chin, let's put Conrad Anker in context. Many of you may have seen the film Meru, Conrad Anker and Jimmy Chin, and then Jimmy did the film Free Solo. But Jimmy talks about Nims, getting completely drunk and then summiting a major 8,000 meter peak the next day. He's like, okay, that's impressive.
And the it's true. And the getting drunk thing is funny because again, it really, I almost feel like as Westerners, it touches a nerve with us, the aesthetic again. Well, hold on a minute. What are you doing getting drunk before you go climb a sacred mountain in Nepal? And if you were to follow Nimsdai on Instagram, I don't recommend it, but if you were, the tents, the base camp tents, before they do a rotation on Everest, it's just like techno music and flashing lights, and they're all taking shots with his clients. And it's an aesthetic that admittedly, I'm kind of like, that's that's what's happening at base camp. But I have to admit, I can't help but say, that's the Nepalis doing it the Nepali way. This is how they're deciding to run this mountain. It's not hurting the mountain to have a dance party, the night before. It's never how I've climbed a mountain, and I can't imagine wanting that, and I hope I'm never the tent next to them. But it's true. You see these things, and you're just like, that's strange. But
there's a great quote in here from Nims, basically saying if you can't function the next day, that's your mess up. Although he doesn't say mess up, he says something else.
Yeah, exactly. So he's kind of like, it's on you to the clients. If you come in and party with us and can't make it up, which, interestingly, Jimmy Chin, my chats with Jimmy Chin, it was hard to humanize Nimsdai, to be honest. Yeah. And I knew that if anyone was going to, it would be Jimmy. because he's worked so closely with him. And he did recount specifically this one of the greatest. Why am I forgetting her name? Jim Morrison's wife.
Yeah, great ski.
She's one of the greatest ski mountaineers, American ski mountaineers out there.
And went missing.
She went missing on Manaslu. She was going to go try and do a ski descent of Manaslu. No.
Help.
Thank you. You look it up while I tell the story. Hillary Nelson.
Yeah.
That's it. Hillary Nelson. Sorry. She went to ski Manaslu with her husband, and it was weird, avalanchy, no visibility weather, and she went missing, and presumably died, fell in a crevasse or something, and they couldn't find her. She was gone, and Jim Morrison, of course, devastated. They had children. He went down to the lower village, and Jimmy
was in the States.
States.
He was supposed to be in a meeting with me, and he called and said, "Can't be there.
Right?
No, got to go to Nepal."
A dear friend of Hillary Nelson's. Dear friend, right?
My friend is missing. I got to go find her.
Yeah.
We think she's dead, but I got to go find her. And he calls NIMS.
Who was at Manaslu Base Camp.
And NIMS organized everything. And it is not an easy thing to do a rescue at that kind of, or a recovery at that kind of altitude, and organized all the crews to go up and down. They found her. They were able to close the loop. And
body retrieval up on these mountains is in itself dangerous, right? You might have another death during a body recovery on these things. And he got his whole guiding team together, stopped his the guiding business he was doing there for a minute.
And he had a tragedy of his own. His office blew up, essentially.
Burned. He lost some employees. Anyway, he went up and retrieved Hillary's body. Wasn't charging anybody.
Yeah.
I think normally you might charge $50,000 for that or something.
Yeah.
That Jimmy can't say enough about the guy, right? He feels like that's who he is.
And it's, from a Western point of view, you get sponsors by putting yourself out there. You get clients by putting yourself out there. The more you beat your chest, the more successful you are. So it's hard to criticize the guy for, examples that we may have painted for him. Yeah.
Yeah, you know what? I think maybe his style that makes it difficult is he really leans into this idea that he's taking the mountaineering guiding industry back, the Himalayan guiding industry back. So he's kind of crowing about taking it back from the Westerners. And I think that that's a huge part of why he sets himself up in opposition, even though the Westerners are quite happy to see this change of hands. None of them are standing in the way. They feel like this is where it was headed all along, and they're glad. But NIMS more portrays it as like, they've been under their thumb for so long, and he's finally getting out. And that's fair. He's rallied a lot of Nepalis. And again, it's all about the pride. Right. The Nepalis have so much pride. I wanted to, just before we forget, it's really important to point out that I told you that there was I forget if it was a Korean that did the 14 peaks in 7 years. And then it was Nimsdai that did them in 7 months. And a few years later, a couple years ago, or 1 year ago, a Norwegian woman, young Norwegian mountaineer, did it in 3 months. And so Nimsdai's record not only did not stand for very long, it was broken by a young woman. And I just love, just because it's Nimsdai, I love it.
Yeah. Like, wilderness records are meant to be broken.
That's right.
So there's a tradition in mountaineering of sort of the Reinhold Messners and the folks who went and pioneered these, even Paul Petzel went and pioneered these climbs. Conrad Anker would be there, and who didn't want to guide, didn't have any interest in guiding. And it's a particular persona that you have to guide. I tried to guide a team on Denali and realized I didn't like the notion of these people didn't know enough to get themselves out of trouble.
Yeah.
And if something happened to me, it would be bad. And I did not like that sensation at all. And so decided that sort of somebody else's life in my hands was not something I wanted to do in dangerous places. And I've been to plenty of dangerous places with folks equally competent. But there's so many stories in the book that reference people I know pretty well. Vern Tejas is a great mountaineer, does a lot of work on Denali. When I left to ski to the South Pole, he was on the same airplane. He was guiding two folks chasing the 7 summits. But a lot of these great guides made their careers guiding the men who were the first, who wanted to be the first to do the 7 summits. Although Vern Tejas is such a character, he decided to do the 7 plummets. He parachuted off all the highest summits, because he could.
And he was actually, I think it was him and Skip Horner simultaneously became the first guides to guide clients up each of the 7 summits. So that's the distinction they hold. And he guided, I don't know if he guided, I think he guided Bass on maybe one of them or something. Yeah. But anyway.
I was on Denali with Vern, and it was the Kentucky 6 expedition. 6 people from Kentucky, and we're at summit camp, and we were really excited because we got to high camp with 6 days of food. Like we're solid, we're golden. And of course it's Alaska, so 8 days of storms, and we ran out of food. And I go over to Vern and I'm like, Vern, I'm hungry, man. He had a group of clients. And I said, I'm hungry. Do you know where there are any caches? He goes, Tori, I know where there's lots of oatmeal. I'm like, I hate oatmeal. And his client sticks his head out. It's like blowing 60 miles an hour. Client sticks his head out of the tent, and Vern goes, it's a stay in your tent or die day. And goes back in, and we were standing out there chatting away about Antarctica and other stuff. And I complained about the oatmeal, but I ate it.
There's a lot of stay in your tent or die days on Denali.
Yeah.
That's kind of what that's all about. About guides, like Vern, I spoke to Vern for a long time. I interviewed a lot of guides, and unlike Nimsdai, guides are actually, I found them to be incredibly easy to humanize. It's almost like if anyone is very cynical about the Everest industry, or anyone who has become cynical about who goes and who's up there, the word greed comes up. So people talk about how they could possibly be willing to take money, right? Put people's lives in danger and take anybody, no matter how inexperienced you are, just for the money. Guides don't make very much money. They live out of their truck.
Dirtbags.
Yeah, they're just, they just love the outdoors. And to be totally honest, they're a different kind of climber. They are climbers, but they're guides. And a lot of them talk about once being clients. A lot of them talk about that moment when they were just like blown away by their guide. They knew nothing. And they were just in that moment where this incredibly competent person was helping them accomplish something that they would never have otherwise been able to do. And it set them on this path in which watching someone go to the summit became more fulfilling than standing on a summit. That was just their thing for the rest of their lives. And that's it.
So just a question about cost, like what does it cost now to climb Everest, and how do the costs differentiate between like a Sherpa company or a Western company? Just curious.
Great question.
Yeah, the good Western companies these days charge about $100,000 to climb Everest. You could probably you can get your price down by choosing less supervision, to be honest. You can ask for fewer Sherpa guides, to look after you. And there's a lot of people that go there that's perfect because they have the experience. The Nepali companies charge about half that at the most. So some of their expeditions are $35,000, $40,000 to climb Everest. And another big piece of the puzzle with the rise of their ownership of the industry, it's because the government doesn't have to charge them for permits and stuff the way. So the government gives them a huge break. tens of thousands of dollars that the Westerners they have to pay as, non-native coming to do business in this country. They just have to pay all these fees for each of their clients, and the Nepalis do not.
Yeah, I was saying earlier that I was invited to join an expedition in '92 for 1993, and in '92 it was $10,000 for the whole expedition, and in '93 the Nepali government changed it. It was $10,000 per person, and I didn't have $10,000, so I didn't climb. We'll get you, Bob, but there's a gentleman here. You're next.
Would you say something about the safety records of the companies, how that's changed over the years? It's sort of the corollary of the costs, I guess.
Yeah. So one thing I do in the book is I plot the sort of building of this infrastructure, an infrastructure that I started to learn was aimed at having 0 deaths. I know that sounds crazy, but every year that these guiding companies were bringing amateurs to the top, they were, let's do this differently this year. There were so many redundancies in place and ideas that they had, technology. All these things kind of developed with the guiding industry to a point that the safety record, the death rates were just falling really fast. You all of a sudden had, maybe a few deaths in a season out of the 600 people climbing, and some seasons with no deaths. And something like that was happening, and it wasn't considered weird anymore. It wasn't considered an anomaly. It was actually because of the infrastructure. And then, of course, because nature always wins, a season would come where something strange would happen, and you'd have maybe mass casualty. 1996 was one of them early on that was written about in Into Thin Air, a little book. And then you had a couple more with some bad seasons. But overall, I think we went down from like 3% to 2% to 1%. And I think today it's 0.5%. So 0.5 of the percent of the people who attempt to climb Everest will die over, there might be no deaths one year, but you know what I'm saying. There were a lot of deaths last year. And so it's gotten remarkably low given what we're talking about here. Mount Everest. I remember I was talking about this with a group, and someone was like, wait a minute, 1 in 200, that's not low. That's crazy. But you just have to remind yourself what you're talking.
Yeah, and everybody has to go through the Khumbu icefall.
Yeah.
It's called an icefall. And ice the size of houses comes down the icefall.
Yeah, and the ice falls all the time.
And warm weather.
Yeah. Yep. And
avalanches and earthquakes. Yeah.
We had a tragic. Some of you may remember a terrible tragedy in the Khumbu icefall one year, 2014. Yeah. There was a fall, an ice fall that killed 16 Sherpas at one moment. And that's just because they all happened to be gathering in one spot because a ladder was broken. And, anyway, again, it's another one of those incidents that has never been fully unpacked in a way that people fully understand. But it changed a lot. It was another pivotal moment on Everest. This is one thing that you'll see. You'll kind of, in the book, you get to these little pivotal moments, and you see that when things like that happen, contrary to maybe what you think, it's not like we just said, hey, business, that's the price of doing business on Everest, let's keep going. Major changes would happen. Major changes, whether it was the Sherpa-led, Westerner-led, Nepali government-led, and I found that to be kind of an uplifting through line, that these things, they never sat still when it came to making it safer.
So brace yourself. There is a journalist in the room that's about to ask you a question. Bob Hill.
I forgot it. A couple questions. How does the sequence work? How do you decide who goes next? How many climbers are there in the average season? How do you pick who goes next?
Do you mean like who kind of gets your place in line going up?
Repeat the question, please.
We'll do that. How do they decide who goes, what's the order of sequence? Who gets to go first? How do you decide who goes in line? Yeah.
And do we mean like to find your place in line getting to the summit? Yeah.
And then how many go an average year?
Okay, so he's asking sort of how you find your spot in the queue to get up to the summit throughout those days. And then the other one, how many are we talking a year? And it's about 600 client climbers attempt Everest every year. And then they're accompanied by at least another 600 guides and Sherpa guides, Western guides and Sherpa guides. It's usually a little more. So you could have as many as 1,500 people trying to climb the mountain in a single year. As far as weirdly, that doesn't ever become a problem. There's usually a lot of coordination within the camps, base camp, camp 2, camp 3. Well, once you're at camp 3, you're going for the summit. But in those lower camps, there's a lot of talk. All the leaders of the expeditions are talking. Are you going up tomorrow? What are you doing? How many clients are you bringing? Okay, that'd be good. We should link up. We should be, you've got 6 clients and I've got 10. We should be one group. What if we did that? From 2 different companies, mind you. Or they say, 7 Summit Treks, they've got 70, clients. They go to them and say, would you mind letting us go first? We're only 16 of us. They usually all just talk and plan it out.
Hello. You mentioned Everest as a metaphor. Each of us having our personal Everest. For example, Dr. Murden wanting to go solo across the Atlantic in a rowboat. For example, Dr. Murden, my question for you, I have one for each of you. Dr. Murden, in less than 100 days, you will be retired. What is your next Everest? And for Mr.
You've had a lot of them.
Cockrell, my question for you is, how important is it for each of us to have personal Everest in the near horizon?
I think we all need Everests, and we all need oceans to cross. There's one quote in the book, it's 12 words, that I don't like. This is the only 12 words in the book I don't like. He's describing a whiteout as if floating in the middle of the ocean in a hurricane. I don't like that. I don't like that. Yep. It's what you're in a whiteout. It's what climbers describe as like being on the inside of a ping pong ball. But on an ocean in a hurricane, the ping pong ball is flipping upside down regularly.
Yeah.
I don't know what I'm going to do after Spalding. I'm going to need another job, but not right away. I was telling my husband, Mac, will understand this, many of you will not, that I kind of want to spend a couple months being a dirtbag. And there's a very small circle of people who understand this as a compliment, and it's you live out of your car, you get off the grid, you don't have any cell phone coverage, you go and climb things or hike or disappear, and no one knows where you are. Now, the problem with this is I'm madly in love with my husband still, and I will have to find a grid from time to time to tell him where I am. But
Bring him.
I want to do that for a little bit. And I'm also building a sailboat in the basement.
Oh, wow.
Because I can't tell you how many times on the ocean I told myself, Tori, they've invented sails. So I'm going to build a sailboat and teach myself how to sail it. So
Incredible.
Yeah.
That is incredible. The way I always look at it is, among the many things we have in common, we're probably both kind of type A personalities. I love just looking down at my ski tracks and going up a mountain, even if, hours of repetition. It's a certain type of person that enjoys that. But typically, throughout my life, I have always said, if I needed to kind of shake things up or just clear my head, the first thing I'm saying is, what would make me uncomfortable? So what's something I might do? And I remember there was a moment when I got into triathlons just because swimming sucks. Right? Swimming is so hard. And I was thinking like, okay, this is going to be an interesting one. And I think as far as each of our Everests, I kind of think that's really where it begins. I think that's why when people like Krakauer and others criticize who climbs Everest, I'm always thinking really it's just people who said first, what's going to make me uncomfortable? What's going to be really hard for me? And most of the time, these people, Everest is just kind of what came to them. They want to. They said, ever since I was a kid, I want to climb Mount Everest, and it's this wild, impossible dream that they end up achieving. And I think that's kind of it. I think it's no matter where we are in our lives, no matter what, it's just what would be a really difficult thing right now.
There's a lovely quote in your book from a guide. Her first name is escaping me. McDonald is her last. Heather McDonald. Yeah. You write a quote. This is why people climb. The first are those seeking to awaken something they feel might be dead or dying inside them. The second group of clients are those looking to discharge something built up, negative energy or attention from something that happened to them or from something they are going through. And finally are the people who just need a new experience to help them reorganize their life a little. And I think we all have those Everests that, leading a university for 14 years and having to deal with a board of trustees, I might need to have to get over that a little bit. But I will look back with pride on the work, but we all need those things for different reasons. But I thought that was a lovely summation. Yes, sir.
Of course, I have two, but one's very simple. What's the altitude of base camp and the altitude of the summit? And the second question is, can you compare going up to going down with respect to degree of difficulty?
First, I've never climbed Everest, so I'm going to be doing my best to channel everything I do know about it. I have climbed some big mountains, and so I can also maybe relate some of that. But base camp is 17,500 feet. That's where you kind of live for 2 months. Very well appointed, cappuccino machines and movie screens, and the summit is 29 and change. The difficulty going up versus down, I probably don't know the answer to that, having not climbed Everest. I know that for me, obviously, going down is always easier, but they say, almost every time they say that when you reach the summit of Mount Everest,
you're halfway.
You're halfway, and even that all the accidents and trouble happens on the way down. Yeah. So I wouldn't necessarily say it's harder, but I think that people get into trouble on the way down, either because it's later in the day than they wanted it to be, either because they're lower on oxygen than they wanted it to be, or their their climbing partners or Sherpas even have had some trouble and had to leave. Right? If you start to go blind, for instance, you can start to go snow blind, and you need to turn around, or frostbite. There's various things where you have to turn around. Those are all instances where you're up like in a space station, out on a tether alone. It can be pretty harrowing getting down. I think a lot of problems going down.
Yeah, and when you are you summit fever, you just got to get to the top, and you can ignore a lot of pain and a lot of discomfort because you're on the way to the top. But once you get to the top, all of a sudden all those aches and pains really start to bother you, and then you're coming down, and then there's high altitude cerebral edema, there's high altitude pulmonary edema. There are things that kill you on this mountain, and coming down is often where it catches up.
Real quick, that's a great point about the adrenaline, because it's true. I think a lot of times you're sort of driven by something that you can't even explain going up, and that disappears the minute you touch the top. And it's like exhaustion.
Right.
It's like for some reason your body was able to stave off exhaustion, and then boom, it sets in.
What has been the impact of the industry on the holiness of the mountain?
Well, it's a tricky one, right? Because this is largely, this would be completely through the eyes of the Nepalis. All the mountains are sacred and holy. You are, in their religion and in their beliefs, you're not really supposed to go on the mountains. They had no interest in ever going on the mountains. And in fact, with many of the bigger mountains in Nepal, in which the summit is considered particularly sacred, I don't know why one would be more than the other, but when you do summit those mountains, you don't touch the top. So even climbers, will go up them and leave the last 2 meters, untouched for that reason, because there are certain mountains that you're really not supposed to go to the top. They're all holy mountains. There was never any intention of going up them. I think the belief is you're just asking for trouble if you do. Why would you tread on the goddess mother of the earth, which is how they refer to Everest. But as we can see, commerce has, allowed them to be looser with their beliefs. They still hold a puja ceremony every time before they climb. You visit lamas as you trek through the Khumbu on your way up. There's a lot of spirituality around it still, tons. But I don't have the exact answer why, but they've clearly, it's important to them this industry is important to them, important to the country.
And, while you think of 1,500 people on the mountain, most of them are on one route, the South Col. And it's a large mountain. The vast majority of it is still unclimbed, untouched, because it's not easy to get up other ways.
Yeah.
Yes.
Is K2 next? And I look forward to your next book, K2 Inc.
Actually, spoiler alert, K2's already there, and it is in the book. That was another piece that another piece of this story that had not really been reported, and it was kind of exciting to, not that K2 has become commercialized, but for reference, K2 is the second highest mountain in the world, but considered suicide. The amount of
far more difficult.
The amount of death around those attempts would make your jaw drop. And the idea of guiding on K2 is almost more preposterous than the idea of guiding on Everest back in the 80s. But there was one American guide who decided to just sort of see if he could bring the infrastructure of Everest, meaning fix the route ahead of time and have the Sherpas in place with the camps and everything, put it on K2, and it worked. And then it worked the next year, and it worked the next year, and I think he's done it 8 times now. So, yeah.
I think the hook is coming.
Okay, yes, sorry about that. I could sit and listen to this myself for another hour. But thank you all very much for coming out tonight. Thank you all for being here. We have a table set up back here where they will be signing. You can purchase books from Carmichael's. Thank you all very much. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tori. Thank you. I appreciate it.